Hey, it's Alex, and today we're looking at dumb influencers that died on Mount Everest. From a solo winter climb, pushed too far for content, to a stage stunt on one of the world's most dangerous mountains that turned fatal in seconds. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest at roughly 28,000 feet. In a season that had packed dozens of climbers into the same narrow summit window. Alina Popa was 26 and worked part-time at a coffee shop in Bucharest, spending 2 years posting budget travel content to TikTok, averaging a few thousand views per clip. Everest was her breakout investment, most of her savings committed to the expedition. Physically, she had trained, and her prior guided summits included Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua. Her previous teammates described her as quiet but stubborn, compliant under supervision, inclined to cut corners when she felt she'd earned it. For me, it seemed like her goal wasn't just the summit. It was capturing the moment raw, which was her undoing. Filming above the balcony wasn't reckless in isolation. The fixed lines had become congested by early morning. Climbers queued in slow, frustrating increments. I think that for someone whose entire purpose on the mountain was documentation, standing still while her phone went unused was a genuine pressure. She filmed the delays, filmed other climbers, and periodically removed her oxygen mask to narrate in short, broken clips into the camera, reseating it each time with visible fumbling through her gloves, but never long enough for the regulator to fully stabilize. Near 28,000 feet. She unclipped from the fixed line to step around a cluster of stopped climbers, moving into deeper and uneven snow for a wider angle. Her Sherpa had instructed her to stay clipped at all times. She stayed off the line longer than he intended. Her oxygen flow rate had already been raised to offset exertion, depleting her supply faster than planned. When she rejoined the line, the margin she had started with was already gone. I think that was the moment this story effectively ended, even if no one recognized it for another few hours. The southeast ridge at 28,000 feet is a narrow spine of wind-packed snow and exposed rock, with open sky pressing in from both sides and nothing to interrupt either the wind or the cold. On descent, the congestion worsened. A German climber positioned directly behind her, and her Sherpa both described her stopping repeatedly. Not to rest, but to film, holding her phone toward other struggling climbers and removing her mask to speak into the frame. According to witnesses, her movements were still coordinated but slower and less precise than earlier. Then, near 27,500 feet, her pace dropped noticeably. She struggled to reclip her safety tether, fumbling the mechanism several times before it caught as her hands hesitated at the gate. The German climber heard her speak through the mask, and later told investigators he couldn't parse any of it. She removed her mask again to narrate. When she tried to reseat it, she couldn't manage the fit on the first 2 attempts, as the mask shifted against her face, covering and stiffened straps. Her Sherpa reached her and found ice forming along the valve and hose, with airflow becoming inconsistent under her breathing. The oxygen tank was nearly depleted. He tried to direct her toward descent. She continued holding the phone up, though the footage was brief and unsteady. The German climber watched the exchange while clipped in place with the line held tight, unable to move forward in the queue. I don't think she understood what was happening to her body, and I don't think anyone could have told her in a way that would have mattered. Then she went to her knees. Her hands became rigid, fingers curled and unresponsive. She was partially moved off the fixed line to clear passage for other climbers. Not a decision made lightly, but one that couldn't wait. Her phone was still loosely in her grip. A descending climber offered supplemental oxygen from his own supply. It was administered briefly but couldn't be spared beyond a few minutes. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. The Sherpa attempted repeatedly to rouse her. She no longer responded to commands or physical contact. The Sherpa radioed down at approximately 7:40 a.m. Supplemental oxygen was requested, but delayed by congestion on the fixed lines. Help reached her position well over an hour later, after slow movement through the line. She was already dead. Medical findings summarized for the expedition record indicated severe hypoxia leading to loss of consciousness at extreme altitude. Her short-form video account was accessed by family after contacting the platform for account control and quietly deactivated within weeks, with most. Public content removed from view. The equipment worked. The weather held. What failed was the distance between what she believed her experience had prepared her for and what the mountain actually required. It was May 5th, 2017, and the afternoon sun at Everest Base Camp was turning the glacial moraine into a wet, shifting mess that soaked through gaiters and pooled between tent platforms. The temperature sat around 30 degrees Fahrenheit. From everything I've heard, it was warm enough to soften ice, but not warm enough to forget where you were. Wind came in bursts from the western CDM, carrying the faint groan of shifting seracs from the Khumbu icefall above. Prayer flags strung between cairns moved in tired arcs, their colors bleached by seasons of ultraviolet. The camp stretched across the glacier in clusters organized by Expedition Company, each group a self-contained village of nylon and aluminum. Among the dozens of expeditions staged that season were Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway, two Americans who had arrived 10 days earlier on a commercial permit through a Kathmandu-based guiding company. Alyssa was 27, from Austin, Texas, a fitness and lifestyle content creator with thousands of followers across multiple platforms. She had built her audience on gym transformation content before pivoting toward what she called extreme wellness, adventure travel repackaged as personal growth. From what I found, her mountaineering experience consisted of a guided Kilimanjaro trek and a guided Elbrus ascent, both completed within the previous 18 months. Neither required technical climbing. Both had produced content that performed well with her audience, and both had reinforced a belief that high-altitude climbing was primarily a fitness challenge her gym-built endurance could handle. From the research I did on her content leading up to this, everything was framed like she'd already conquered altitude when she hadn't even touched it. Jess was 26, from Portland, Oregon, a travel content creator who had been Alyssa's college roommate. Jess had climbed Kilimanjaro alongside Alyssa, but had no other mountaineering experience. Her preparation for Everest had been a 12-week program designed by a personal trainer with no high-altitude background, endurance running and weighted stair intervals. She was fit by conventional standards, but had never spent a night above 19,000 feet, never used crampons on actual ice, and never clipped into a fixed rope where a fall carried real consequences. I kept coming back to this. 2 Kilimanjaro treks between them. That was the entire resume they brought to Everest. The expedition had been planned as a joint content project. Both women had secured brand partnerships conditional on summit content. Photographs and video from the top that would anchor campaigns for an apparel company and a supplement brand. The financial arrangement meant their presence on Everest was not merely personal ambition. It was a deliverable. That commercial pressure sat beneath every decision they would make on the mountain. I need you to remember that detail. It matters later. Their expedition company assigned Karsang Tendi as lead Sherpa. Karsang was 35, from Tame in the upper Khumbu Valley. He had summited Everest 9 times over 14 seasons, beginning as a kitchen assistant at base camp at 19 and working his way into guiding through years of load carries, rope-fixing shifts, and the quiet accumulation of competence that defined a career in the Himalayan guiding industry. He was not large by Western standards, compact and efficient, with a frame built by altitude rather than a weight room. But believe me when I say this, Sherpas really have superhuman strength. That muscle alone doesn't show. He spoke measured English and had a reputation among expedition operators as someone who could manage difficult personalities without creating conflict. He had guided clients who were frightened, clients who were overconfident, and clients who treated him as invisible. 14 seasons on Everest had taught him to read a client's chances within the first week, not through any single indicator, but through the accumulation of small observations. How they breathed at rest, how they ate, how they responded to discomfort, whether they listened when the mountain was trying to tell them something. He had not yet guided clients whose primary purpose on the mountain was producing photographs of themselves. Honestly, when I found out how many seasons this man had under his belt, it made what comes next so much harder to sit with. A second Sherpa was assigned to assist. Younger, mid-20s, 3 Everest summits, quiet and efficient. His role was support, carrying equipment, managing oxygen, and providing a second set of hands on technical sections. The first acclimatization rotation began on May 7th, through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. The icefall was a frozen cascade of shifting ice blocks and crevasses, requiring passage over aluminum ladders spanning open gaps. Experienced climbers moved through quickly, minimizing exposure to hazards they could not control. Alyssa and Jess moved slowly. Both struggled with the altitude transition. Breathing labored at an elevation where supplemental oxygen was not yet used. Jess's hesitation at the first major ladder crossing backed up climbers behind them. Alyssa stopped repeatedly to film. Short clips of crevasse walls, ladder crossings, the chaotic geometry of the icefall. Despite Karsong's reminders that speed through this section was a safety priority, not a preference. They reached Camp 1 in just over 7 hours, roughly 2 hours slower than Karsang's typical client pace. Jess had vomited twice during the final hour. Alyssa complained of a persistent headache she blamed on dehydration. Karsang noted both symptoms and said nothing that evening, but the picture was already forming. And this is the part that gets to me. He could already see it going wrong. The second rotation, to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, confirmed what the first had suggested. Both women arrived visibly depleted and spent their acclimatization nights alternating between forced rest and content production. Their oxygen saturation levels, measured by the expedition doctor, sat at the lower end of acceptable ranges, functional but without the physiological margin that separated climbers who thrived at altitude from those who merely survived it. Jess's readings were low enough to prompt the doctor to recommend additional acclimatization time. In an article I read covering expedition medical protocols, those borderline saturation numbers are exactly where the line between cleared and condemned gets dangerously thin. Karsang raised his concerns with the expedition leader, a Nepali operator named Sanjay, who ran the company from Kathmandu. He reported that both clients were struggling with basic acclimatization, that their technical skills were minimal, and that their pace on the Lhasa face would likely be dangerously slow. He recommended extending their schedule or advising against the summit push. The response came back within hours. Sanjay acknowledged the concerns, but noted both clients had been cleared by the doctor, their saturation was within parameters, and many clients who struggled during rotations performed adequately during the summit push when supplemental oxygen was available. He reminded Karsang that the clients had paid full fees. The conversation was polite, professional, and final. That right there is what frustrates me most about these commercial operations. The guide raises the alarm, and the system just absorbs it and moves on. The third rotation took them to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, a wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees, requiring front pointing on crampons while clipped to fixed ropes with mechanical ascenders. It was the first genuinely technical terrain the women had encountered, and the gap between what Kilimanjaro had asked of them and what the Lhotse face demanded was immediate and brutal. Jess's crampon technique was inefficient. She kicked too many times to set each point, wasting energy with every step, her calves burning through reserves she would need higher on the mountain. Alyssa moved slightly better, but paused frequently, her breathing audible through the wind that swept across the face. Both required direct assistance from Karsang and the assistant Sherpa at anchor transitions, where switching between rope sections demanded coordination they had not internalized. And based on the info and photos I found online, the face stretched above them in an unbroken sweep of blue ice, nearly 3,700 vertical feet from base to crest. And the women were climbing it at a pace that consumed time and oxygen the summit push could not afford to lose. They reached Camp 3 after 9 hours. Most guided clients completed it in 6 to 7. Both collapsed into their tent and did not emerge until Karsang brought water and food to them. Their faces carried the hollow gray look that altitude imposed on bodies working beyond capacity. Jess spent the night coughing, dry and persistent, a possible sign of early pulmonary edema. By morning, the cough had subsided. The expedition doctor, consulted by radio, cleared her to continue. If you've watched my other videos, you know exactly what that clearance means. To me, it's not a green light, it's a liability transfer. Karsang discussed the situation that evening with 3 Sherpas from other expeditions. A quiet conversation outside the cooking tent at Camp 2. He described the slow pace, the marginal acclimatization, the client's inability to recognize their own limitations. The other Sherpas listened without surprise. One asked directly whether Karsang believed the women would survive the summit push. He did not answer. He said everything depended on weather, oxygen management, and turnaround discipline. But his expression, according to those present, communicated what his words did not. And that part honestly sat heavy with me. The summit window opened on May 21st, 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies. Teams began staging upward from base camp, and the mountain filled with movement. Alyssa and Jess pushed through Camp 2 and Camp 3 over the following days, reaching Camp 4 on the South Col at 2:15 p.m. on May 23rd, later than planned. They settled into a tent on the windswept plateau amid the debris of decades, empty oxygen cylinders, shredded tent fabric, frozen waste, and the silence that altitude imposed on everything. Karsang checked their oxygen supplies and calculated the math that would determine whether they lived or died. Each woman had 3 bottles for the summit push, 1 for climbing, 1 for descent, 1 reserve. At standard flow rates, each bottle provided roughly 6 hours of supplemental oxygen. The round trip typically required 14 to 16 hours for guided clients. The math worked, but only if everything went according to plan. There was no margin for delays, increased flow, or the kind of slow progress both women had demonstrated throughout the expedition. Stay with me here, because from this point forward, the math is driving everything. They departed Camp 4 at 12:45 a.m. on May 24th, 15 minutes behind schedule. Jess had struggled to get crampon straps adjusted in the dark, her fingers clumsy inside thick gloves. Above them, a line of headlamps already stretched up the triangular face toward the balcony, each light marking a climber consuming oxygen and time on the same fixed ropes. The cold was severe, at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, before wind chill, believe me. At that altitude, it was the kind of cold that found every gap in layering and punished any exposed skin within minutes. The climb was steep but manageable on fixed ropes, hard snow, an occasional rock demanding careful crampon placement, and sustained effort in air that held barely a third of sea level oxygen. The climb was slow from the start. Both women moved below the minimum pace Karsang had calculated as necessary to summit and return within their oxygen window. Alyssa held a slightly steadier rhythm, her fitness showing in the consistency of her steps, if not their speed. Jess labored behind, each step requiring a pause that lasted several breaths longer than it should have, her headlamp beams swaying with the effort of keeping upright. Karsang stayed close to Jess, monitoring for the deterioration he expected. The assistant Sherpa climbed behind Alyssa, managing the spare oxygen bottles and watching the line of lights above them grow further away. They reached the balcony at 5:40 a.m., 90 minutes behind pace. Karsang checked gauges and found both women had consumed more oxygen than projected, their elevated breathing rates burning through supply faster than assumed. He replaced their bottles and recalculated. If they maintained current pace, they would reach the summit around 1 p.m., an hour past turnaround. The descent would consume remaining oxygen with almost nothing in reserve. He communicated this plainly, using numbers rather than abstractions. Alyssa asked how many other climbers were still going up. The answer was dozens. She told Karsang they would continue and manage their energy. Jess nodded without speaking, her body language communicating exhaustion rather than agreement. The way I read that moment, she wasn't agreeing to continue. She just didn't have the energy left to disagree. The South Summit appeared at 10:20 a.m., 28,700 feet, more than 2 hours behind. Turnaround. Karsang checked oxygen again. Alyssa had roughly 4 hours remaining. Jess had closer to 3. The summit was 90 minutes above. The descent to Camp 4 would take at least 5 hours at their pace. The arithmetic no longer worked. Karsang told both women they needed to turn around. He stated this plainly, without diplomacy, because at 28,700 feet, there was no time for negotiation. Alyssa refused. She pointed to climbers still moving above them. She argued they had come too far, that others with similar oxygen were continuing, that they could reduce flow on descent. Jess said nothing, standing slightly behind Alyssa, her posture sagging, her eyes glassy and unfocused above the oxygen mask. Karsang contacted base camp by radio and reported his recommendation. The expedition leader consulted the base camp manager, who noted other teams were still pushing and conditions remained stable. The decision came back. Clients could continue at their own discretion. The company would not order a mandatory turnaround. Karsang clipped back into the fixed rope and continued upward. He did not argue further. The system had spoken, and his role within it did not include the authority to physically stop paying clients from climbing. When I discovered that the company relayed that decision from a satellite phone in Kathmandu, not even from base camp, I had to read it twice. They cleared the Hillary Step at 12:05 p.m. after a 30-minute queue that burned oxygen and body heat in equal measure. The final summit ridge stretched ahead, a narrow spine of snow with Tibet on one side and Nepal on the other. Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway reached the summit of Mount Everest at 12:48 p.m. on May 24, 2017. They stood at 29,029 feet, nearly an hour past turnaround, with oxygen supplies that could not sustain the descent ahead of them. Kairsang gave them 5 minutes and stated the number once. Both women removed brand banners from inside their suits and posed while the assistant Sherpa photographed. Alyssa produced a small tripod and mounted her phone for video, adjusting the angle twice. Jess stood beside her, holding a sponsor's flag, her smile invisible behind her oxygen mask, but performable through posture. The 5 minutes became 10. Alyssa asked for additional shots. Kairsang repeated that they needed to descend. Another 3 minutes passed before the cameras were stowed. They left the summit at 1:01 p.m., 13 minutes at the top. Every one of those minutes had been borrowed from the margin that would have kept them alive. Only 13 minutes at the top. I need you to let that land. The descent hit traffic immediately. Climbers still ascending, while summiteers tried to descend on the same fixed ropes. By the time they cleared the bottleneck and reached the south summit at 2:30 p.m., Jess's oxygen was critical. Kairsang checked her gauge. Less than 45 minutes remaining at current flow. Camp 4 was at least 5 hours below. Reserve bottle was the last full bottle between both clients. He switched Jess to the reserve and reduced her flow to the minimum that would keep her moving. Alyssa had roughly 2 hours remaining. The assistant Sherpa carried one partially used emergency bottle, perhaps 90 minutes. Between two clients, approximately 3.5 hours of combined oxygen for a 5-hour descent. Below the balcony, at approximately 27,000 feet, Jess stopped walking. She did not collapse. She simply ceased movement, standing on the fixed rope with her ice axe planted, her weight resting against it. Breathing rapid despite the mask, legs trembling. Kairsang reached her within seconds and found her unresponsive to verbal instructions. Her eyes tracked movement but showed no comprehension. She had entered the cognitive collapse that severe hypoxia produced, conscious but no longer capable of translating information into action. Believe me, I've covered enough of these to know. Once you see that description, the window is already closed. Kairsang and the assistant Sherpa attempted to move her physically, supporting her weight between them, 10 steps at a time, her boots dragging grooves in the snow between placements. The effort demanded enormous energy at an altitude where every movement cost 3 times what it would at sea level. The pace it produced would not reach Camp 4 before dark, before oxygen ran out, before the cold took what the altitude had started. Alyssa descended ahead on the fixed line, her own pace deteriorating as her supply diminished. She stopped frequently to look back, watching the two Sherpas struggle with her friend's weight, her posture shifting between the impulse to help and the physical inability to climb back up. Honestly, no matter your opinion of the two, this is heartbreaking. At 4:15 p.m., Alyssa's oxygen emptied. She was at roughly 26,600 feet, 600 vertical feet above Camp 4. Without supplemental oxygen, deterioration came fast. Within minutes, her coordination faltered, her steps shortening to shuffles. The precise crampon placements she had managed all day dissolving into clumsy scrapes against the snow. She sat down at 4:30 p.m. and did not stand again. And I wish I could say this gets better, but bear with me, it's about to get a whole lot worse. Kairsang faced the calculation the mountain eventually forced on every guide who stayed too long. Behind him, Jess was no longer moving under her own power. Ahead, Alyssa sat motionless. His own oxygen was running low, each breath delivering less than his body needed to sustain the effort of keeping 2 dying clients alive. The assistant Sherpa, working without supplemental oxygen for the past hour to preserve supply for clients, was showing impairment, slow responses, unsteady footing, the mechanical movements of a body running on reserves it did not have. They reached Alyssa and attempted to rouse her. She responded to contact, but could not stand. Kairsang administered the last emergency oxygen. For several minutes, her breathing improved, but the bottle held less than an hour, and Camp 4 remained unreachable at their pace. Darkness arrived near 6 p.m. Temperature dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind increased to gusts that made standing difficult. Kairsang made the decision that would follow him off the mountain and out of the profession. He and the assistant Sherpa began descending toward Camp 4 to organize a rescue with fresh oxygen and manpower. Leaving meant accepting the possibility that neither woman would survive. Staying meant all 4 of them would die. And I think no matter how many times I cover stories like this, that specific moment where a guide has to walk away from someone still breathing is the one I can never get used to. He reached Camp 4 at 8:15 p.m. A rescue team of 4 Sherpas from 2 expeditions departed within 30 minutes, climbing back into darkness with headlamps and oxygen. They found Jess first, at approximately 26,800 feet. She was no longer breathing, slumped against the fixed rope, ice forming along the edges of her mask. They continued upward and found Alyssa 200 vertical feet below where she had been left, suggesting she had tried to descend alone. She was seated in the snow, pitched forward over her knees. The emergency bottle lay empty beside her. No pulse detectable through layers. The rescue team waited, checked again, and descended without her. From everything I could find, that team climbed back up knowing what they'd most likely find. And they went anyway. Alyssa Brennan and Jess Calloway were declared dead on the upper slopes of Everest on May 25, 2017. Both found within sight of the South Col, less than 700 vertical feet from the tents where warmth and oxygen waited. Cause of death for both was listed as hypoxia and exposure at extreme altitude. They were 27 and 26 years old. The bodies remained where they fell. The brand partnerships that had financed the expedition were quietly dissolved. The content they had produced during the climb, weeks of photos and videos, remained on their accounts, where followers who did not yet know what had happened continued leaving encouraging comments beneath the last posts uploaded from Camp 2. That detail stays with me more than almost anything else in this story. Karsang Tendi did not return to Everest the following season. Colleagues who saw him in Kathmandu described a man who had difficulty sleeping, who avoided conversations about the mountain, who flinched at sounds that carried no threat. He told one close friend that he could not stop replaying the final hours, the descent, the decision to leave, the walk to Camp 4, knowing what he was leaving behind. The assistant Sherpa suffered frostbite damage to several fingers that required partial amputation. He returned to his village and did not seek guiding work. Again, 2 careers ended, and to me, that's the part nobody talks about. The mountain doesn't just take the ones who die. Neither man spoke publicly about the incident. The mountain had taken 2 lives and ended 2 careers, and the silence that followed was its own kind of aftermath. It was September 3rd, 2014, on the Gouda route high above the Tête Rousse Glacier in the French Alps, where the air at roughly 14,000 feet doesn't warn you. It simply collects its toll, quietly and without ceremony, from anyone who hasn't prepared to pay it. Elise Marot was 22 years old from Lyon, France. She had built a modest but growing TikTok following by documenting what she called aesthetic travel content. Short clips of herself in carefully considered outfits against dramatic backdrops, coastal cliffs, lavender fields, limestone gorges. Mont Blanc was her next location. Her hiking experience was real, but limited to trails well below significant altitude, and she had no prior exposure to high-altitude weather systems. She seemed like someone who had not yet learned to respect a thing she had never encountered. The decision to pack light made sense within the frame she had built around the trip. Heavy insulation doesn't photograph the way thin layers do against open sky. She brought light gloves, a mid-layer fleece, and a wind shell. Each item deliberate, but each item insufficient. A morning forecast noted moderate winds with a possible temperature drop near the summit, but the language of forecasts compresses badly in the mind of someone who has never felt what those words mean at altitude. Other climbers at the overnight refuge noted her thin, insufficient gear. A guide on the route mentioned it directly to her. Apparently she acknowledged it, said she planned a quick turnaround, and yet did not change her plan. I don't think she was being dismissive. I think she genuinely didn't have the reference point to understand what she was being warned about. The Gouda route above 12,000 feet is a narrow spine of compacted snow, an exposed rock where the wind has no terrain left to break against before it reaches you. She left the refuge before dawn with a small group of independent climbers and a route guide. The early hours were manageable. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted and picked up beyond what the forecast suggested, and the temperature had dropped sharply, She stopped twice to film short clips, removing her gloves each time to operate her phone. Climbers moving past her noted she was already stopping more frequently than the pace required. By the time the group reached the upper ridge approach, she was visibly slower. A climber directly behind her later told investigators she had begun fumbling with her phone, not filming, just attempting to grip it, before it slipped from her hand into the snow. She retrieved it, but her hands did not close around it the way hands normally close. They pressed against it. The climber described her grip as flat and uncoordinated. Her speech when she responded to questions from the guide had taken on a quality he described as slightly behind, words arriving at the right intervals, but without sharpness behind them. She stumbled twice on crampon placements that should have been routine. The guide attempted to turn her around. She took several more steps upward before stopping on her own. This is the part I find hardest to process. Not because it was sudden, but because it wasn't. It happened in plain view, incrementally, and the people around her were watching it unfold without the tools to stop it. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. She began shivering in the sustained, full-body way that signals a system working hard to compensate. Then the shivering slowed. 2 climbers flanked her and began moving her back down the ridge. Her crampon placements became unreliable, each step requiring direct guidance. Within minutes of the descent beginning, she sat down in the snow and could not stand without being physically lifted. Her head dropped forward. A climber supporting her left arm described her eyes as open, but not tracking. Her responses to direct questions stopped entirely. She remained unresponsive during extraction and transport, and rescuers continued active rewarming and monitoring during the flight before she was later pronounced dead at the Valley Hospital. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be fatal hypothermia with associated cardiac arrhythmia, secondary to core temperature collapse. In the weeks after her death, short clips from her trip were shared by a small fashion-focused TikTok account. Viewers began commenting on her clothing choices, and the footage before the posts were mass-reported and removed. I've thought about that a lot. The last images of her that circulated weren't about what happened. They were about what she was wearing when it did. That feels like its own kind of cruelty, separate from the mountain entirely, and one that nobody was held accountable for. It was April 9th, 2023, and the morning air over Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu carried a yellow haze of pollution and diesel fumes that blurred the Himalayan skyline into a smudge of white and gray. Temperatures hovered in the mid-60s, warm and thick compared to the altitudes waiting to the northeast. Taxi horns competed with motorcycle engines beyond the terminal, and the smell of exhaust mixed with incense from a street-side shrine near the arrivals gate. Among the climbers moving through customs that morning was Cade Moreau, a 27-year-old from San Diego, California. Cade stood, 6'1", and carried the kind of physique that performed well on camera. Wide shoulders, visible abdominals, the sculpted product of 5 years training 6 days a week in Southern California gyms. His TikTok following had climbed past 11,000, built on shirtless training clips, physique updates, and motivational captions delivered in the language of relentless self-improvement. His bio described him as an athlete, content creator, and adrenaline addict. The last label was the most honest. From every bit of info I gathered, apparently people who knew Cade described a pattern that had defined him since his early 20s. He cycled through obsessions with an intensity that consumed hobbies the way fire moved through dry brush. Skateboarding, then motocross, then open water swimming, then obstacle course racing. Each pursued with total commitment until the novelty faded and the next fixation replaced it. The gym lasted longest because it offered daily, visible feedback. And as someone who's into fitness, I get that. But I think this is where the relatability will end for me. Because by late 2021, even that felt insufficient. Cade told friends he needed something bigger, something that couldn't be contained inside a building with air conditioning and mirrors. He discovered mountaineering through a TikTok account run by a 32-year-old climber from Colorado, who documented high-altitude expeditions with cinematic footage and polished editing. The account had over 200,000 followers, and its creator had summited peaks across 3 continents over more than a decade of serious climbing. Cade consumed every video in the archive across a single weekend. And I want you to let that sink in, He just watched a couple videos online and decided he could do the same thing. Within a month, he had signed up for a guided climb of Mount Whitney, completed it without difficulty, and treated the summit photo as confirmation that his conditioning translated directly to mountaineering. Over the following 14 months, he added Kilimanjaro and Elbrus, both non-technical routes that rewarded endurance over skill. His content shifted accordingly. Mountain footage began to dominate, with summit photos and training montages captioned with references to Everest as his ultimate goal. And I want you to stay with me on this one, but he told friends Everest was just a bigger version of what he had already done. When one friend, a recreational climber with Cascades experience, pointed out that an 8,000-meter peak bore no resemblance to guided treks on Kilimanjaro, Cade laughed and said the friend sounded like someone who had never tried anything hard enough to be scared by it. The comment ended the friendship. That alone told me everything about where his head was at. It also captured something essential about how Cade processed risk. He had never encountered a challenge his body could not power through, and this unbroken record had calcified into a belief that willpower could substitute for the technical knowledge and altitude experience he did not possess. He booked his expedition in January 2023, paying $65,000 to a mid-tier commercial operator that accepted clients with limited high-altitude credentials. His mother called after seeing the announcement he posted on TikTok, a 30-second video of himself packing gear with a caption promising he would be standing on top of the world soon. The call was brief. She told him calmly but seriously that if he would listen to her, he would never go near that mountain. She told him one mistake at those altitudes could change everything. Cade told her she was worrying about nothing. He said he had watched dozens of people summit Everest online, and that most of them looked far less prepared than he was. The call ended with his mother asking him to be careful, and Cade assuring her it would be easy. And I want you to remember that, because it comes back around. He arrived at Everest Base Camp on April 15th after a 6-day trek from Lukla. The camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet, a temporary city of tents, solar panels, and satellite dishes clustered by Expedition Company. Prayer flags stretched between rock cairns, their fabric shredded by seasons of UV and wind. The scale of the mountain above was difficult to process, a wall of ice and rock rising another 11,000 vertical feet through zones of increasing hostility. I think most people can't even fully grasp what that looks like in person until they're standing under it. His expedition company assigned him a lead climbing Sherpa named Kanchub Hote, a 41-year-old from the Solukhumbu district with 8 Everest summits across 18 years of guiding. Kancha was quieter than most climbing Sherpas, known for an economy of words that made each statement land with weight. He had guided clients through summit pushes in whiteout conditions, managed death zone evacuations, and lost 2 close friends to Serac collapses in the Khumbu icefall, which honestly just breaks my heart at how common it is for Sherpas. His reputation among operators was built on a single quality. He brought clients home alive, even when they made decisions that should have killed them. Concha recognized the type within 48 hours. The most dangerous clients were never the weak or the frightened. The frightened listened. The weak turned back. The dangerous ones were the strong and confident, climbers whose physical ability convinced them the mountain operated on rules they could overpower. Cade confirmed the assessment almost immediately. From everything I gathered during the research, Concha saw exactly where this was heading. While other climbers attended briefings on route conditions and emergency protocols, Cade filmed content. He recorded TikToks of himself doing pull-ups on a boulder near camp, flexing against the icefall backdrop, delivering monologues about mental toughness into his phone. When the acclimatization schedule was described, climbing high and sleeping low over several weeks, Cade asked publicly how the timeline could be compressed. When Kancha explained that acclimatization could not be rushed, that the body required weeks to produce additional red blood cells and adapt to reduced oxygen, Cade responded that his cardiovascular conditioning would compensate. He referenced his resting heart rate as if that number meant anything at 26,000 feet. And bear with me here, because every one of these moments is a domino. The first rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet revealed what gym fitness could not do. Cade moved through the icefall quickly, his raw strength allowing him to haul across ladder bridges with less effort than most clients. But above Camp 1, the altitude began its work. Headaches started the first night. Dizziness arrived the following morning. These were standard acclimatization. As symptoms, the correct response was patience, hydration, time. Cade's response was irritation. He pushed to climb higher ahead of schedule. Concha refused, explaining that dismissing early altitude sickness was how treatable conditions became fatal ones. Cade spent the evening recording a video describing the headaches as proof he was pushing limits other climbers respected too much. He repackaged a warning sign as content. That's the part that gets me. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at 21,200 feet on schedule, despite Cade's repeated requests to accelerate. At Camp 2, Cade observed other clients using supplemental oxygen during rest periods, standard practice to improve recovery and preserve cognitive function at altitude. Cade filmed himself refusing a bottle offered by Concha, narrating into his camera that he intended to climb without supplemental oxygen. He described the approach as doing it raw, framing what was medically reckless as superior toughness. The video performed, well, comments praised his determination. None of the commenters understood that refusing oxygen at those altitudes degraded judgment, coordination, and the body's ability to recover from exertion that each day above 20,000 feet demanded. Concha addressed the issue directly during the next planning session. He explained that supplemental oxygen was a survival tool, not a crutch, and that even Sherpas who had spent their lives in the Khumbu used it above Camp 3 as standard practice. Cade listened with the polite detachment of someone who had already decided the advice did not apply to him. I've covered enough of these stories to recognize that look, it never ends well. He finally accepted a bottle at Camp 3 around 23,500 feet, only after his coordination on the Lhotse face deteriorated to the point where his crampon placements became visibly inconsistent. Concha noted in his logbook that Cade's acclimatization was marginal. Oxygen saturation readings were lower than expected for his fitness level, confirmation that cardiovascular conditioning and altitude adaptation were separate biological processes. Concha communicated his concerns to the expedition leader, who noted them but did not restrict Cade's participation. The client had paid $65,000. The commercial math was familiar and ugly. And that right there is what I keep circling back to. Someone had every reason to stop this and didn't. The summit window opened on May 18th, a narrow band of reduced wind and clear skies predicted to hold for roughly 48 hours. Cade departed base camp on May 19th, ascending through the icefall in pre-dawn darkness, reaching Camp 2 by early afternoon. He continued to Camp 3 the following morning, then pushed to Camp 4 on the South Col, arriving mid-afternoon on May 20th. The Col was a desolate, wind-blasted plateau, scattered with the debris of decades, crushed oxygen bottles, shredded tent fabric, frozen waste. The wind held steady at about 25 miles per hour. Cade forced down energy gels and broth, his appetite gone at an altitude where the body consumed itself to stay alive. From what I found, by this point, multiple people on the expedition had privately questioned whether he should be going higher. Shortly before midnight, Concha woke him for the summit push. A second Sherpa, Sonam Dendi, 33 years old, 4 summits, would accompany them. The expedition's Western guide reinforced the turnaround time during the final briefing. If they had not reached the summit by early afternoon, they would turn around regardless of proximity. Cade acknowledged the protocol without comment. They departed Camp 4 around midnight, joining a string of headlamps stretching up the triangular face. The cold was ferocious, roughly minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. Cade climbed steadily, his strength still an asset on the steep fixed ropes. But his pace was slower than it should have been, the marginal. Acclimatization Concha had flagged was expressing itself as reduced efficiency, each step requiring slightly more effort, each rest stop lasting slightly longer. They reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, roughly around dawn. Concha found Cade's oxygen consumption running higher than planned and swapped in a fresh bottle. Cade showed no obvious distress, but his movements had lost the fluid confidence of lower altitudes. He sat heavily during the rest and took longer to stand when Concha signaled to continue. His body was already giving the answer. He just wasn't listening. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet by mid-morning, where a queue had formed at the traverse leading to the Hillary Step. The bottleneck funneled dozens of climbers onto a single fixed line across a knife-edge ridge with massive exposure on both sides. Each person ahead added minutes of standing still in the death zone, burning oxygen and body heat. Cade waited with visible impatience. Kancha monitored him closely and noticed his coordination had degraded further. A gloved hand missing the rope on the first grab, a crampon placement landing slightly off its mark. The errors were not dangerous in isolation, but they indicated a nervous system operating below capacity. And you'll see why that matters in a minute. They cleared the Hillary Step roughly an hour and a half later. However, Kancha had been watching the sky. Cloud formations building to the west suggested the weather window was compressing faster than forecast. He stopped Cade on the ridge and told him directly that conditions were deteriorating and that they should turn back. Sonam supported the recommendation, gesturing toward the cloud bank thickening along the western horizon. Cade refused. He had not come this far to quit within sight of the summit. It horrified me when I read this part, but he turned and kept climbing, and believe me, it only gets worse from here. Cade Moreau reached the summit of Mount Everest just before noon on May 21st, 2023. He stood at 29,032 feet under skies that were beginning to lose their clarity, a thin haze filtering sunlight that had been sharp an hour earlier. Kancha and Sonam arrived within minutes. Trust me, what happened next consumed about 7 minutes that neither Sherpa could recover. Cade pulled out his phone, kept warm inside his down suit against his chest, and began filming. He recorded a TikTok, speaking into the camera with the summit behind him, telling his audience he had told them it would be easy. He flexed through his layers, raised both arms after unclipping his ice axe from its harness. The performance was directed at an audience thousands of miles away who would watch on screens in warm rooms. Kancha urged him to finish. Sonam pointed toward the western sky, where the cloud bank was building visibly. Cade waved them off and continued filming. Then he finally made the mistake that would cost him everything. To adjust the angle of his phone, Cade pulled off his right glove. The air temperature at the summit was approximately minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. At the wind speeds present on the ridge, exposed skin reached frostbite threshold in under a minute. His bare hand was in the open air for roughly 45 seconds as he repositioned the phone and attempted to frame a final shot. By the time he pulled the glove back on, the damage was done. His fingers had lost all sensation, the nerve endings deadened by cold that penetrated tissue faster than circulation could compensate. For a TikTok, all of that. For a TikTok, I want you to really let that simmer. The loss of feeling became critical about 90 seconds later, when Cade began descending the summit ridge. The route required clipping and unclipping from fixed ropes at each anchor point, a mechanical process demanding functional grip and fine motor control in both hands. His left hand managed the carabiner adequately. His right hand could not close around the gate with enough pressure to operate it. He fumbled the first clip, managed the second on the third attempt, and by the fourth anchor point, his right hand had become a blunt instrument, the fingers curled but unresponsive. This is where I need you to really picture the situation. 3 feet of snow, thousands of feet of nothing on either side, and one working hand. Kancha moved close to assist, reaching across the narrow ridge to clip Cade's carabiner at each transition. The terrain was severe, a snow ridge perhaps 3 feet wide, with thousands of feet of exposure on both sides. Wind had increased to close to 40 miles per hour. Cade's balance was compromised by fatigue, marginal oxygen, and the cognitive impairment that roughly 12 hours above 26,000 feet guaranteed. Everything that could go wrong was already going wrong. He just couldn't process it anymore. About half an hour into the descent, roughly 200 feet below the summit, Cade stopped to reposition. His footing where the ridge narrowed to less than 2 feet. He planted his right boot, but the placement was off, too far to the edge, crampon points engaging soft snow rather than the harder layer beneath. His weight shifted onto the compromised foot and the snow gave way. His left hand shot out and caught the fixed rope. His right hand reached simultaneously but could not close. The frozen fingers slid across the surface without gripping. His full body weight transferred to his left arm. an arm already depleted by about 13 hours of climbing and oxygen deprivation. The muscles held for roughly 2 seconds before the load exceeded what they could sustain. Concha lunged forward, dropping to his knees on the ridge, and caught Cade's left wrist just as his grip on the rope failed. Cade looked up at him and communicated the only thing his failing body could register, that he couldn't feel his hands. For a fraction of a second, Concha held him, about 200 pounds of body, and gear pulling against a man braced on a knife-edge ridge in near 40-mile-per-hour wind. And I want you to bear in mind how much of a superhuman feat that is. Concha's shoulder absorbed the shock. Something in the joint gave way. A sound Sonam later described as a dull, wet snap, audible even through the wind. Concha's left arm went slack and the grip broke. Cade Moreau fell from the summit ridge of Mount Everest moments later. Witnesses on the south summit described a dark shape tumbling down the southwest face, accelerating across hard snow and exposed rock until the mountain's geometry carried him beyond sight. He was 27 years old. The aftermath of what happens honestly breaks me even more, but Kancha Bhode was evacuated from Camp 4 by helicopter the following morning with a complete dislocation of his left shoulder and a torn rotator cuff sustained during the attempted catch. Doctors in Kathmandu determined the joint would never recover full load bearing, a capacity ending 18 years of high-altitude guiding in a single moment. Cade's body was spotted 2 days later, lodged on a rock feature roughly 2,500 feet below the ridge. Recovery was not attempted. He remained on the mountain. In the weeks that followed, Cade's TikTok account gained over 4,000 followers. Old clips resurfaced, him laughing about Everest, calling it easy, flexing in front of the icefall. Comments filled with mockery, shock, and criticism. His mother did not make a public statement, but people close to the family said she replayed that phone call constantly, the one where she told him one mistake could change everything, and he told her it would be easy. Friends repeated the same observation. He always pushed too far, and nobody could ever tell him otherwise. And based on every single climb I've covered on this channel, I can guarantee all of you that Everest is not a content opportunity. It is not a challenge designed for ego. Even strong bodies and confident minds mean nothing against a mountain that doesn't care who you are. His ego didn't just push him to the top, it made sure he would never come back. It was July 28, 2016, on the upper face of K2 in northern Pakistan, at 26,200 feet above sea level, a place that has taken more lives per summit attempt than almost any other mountain on Earth. Maris Cho was a 29-years-old content creator on TikTok from Alberta, Canada. The previous year she had summited Everest via a fully guided commercial expedition, and with the way the story went, I think that achievement had changed how she understood her own ceiling. She had since built her TikTok around it, posting gear shots and summit photographs. And K2 was the next planned step in a progression she had mapped on her own terms. What she had not mapped was the technical gap between a commercially managed Himalayan route and a mountain with inconsistent fixed infrastructure and no tolerance for improvisation. I think the Everest summit genuinely convinced her she had crossed into a category of climber she had not yet reached. That is not a character flaw. K2 simply does not negotiate on that point. Her guide had flagged her ascender technique on lower sections earlier in the day. She consistently seated the device at an angle rather than fully engaging the cam against the rope. She adjusted briefly each time and continued upward without resolving the underlying habit. At a rest stop below the bottleneck, she filmed a short clip from an exposed position with the valley floor thousands of feet below, unclipping briefly from one line while repositioning to the next, fixed segment before reattaching. A nearby climber later told investigators it was the kind of casual behavior that made experienced alpinists uneasy. The guide warned her specifically about the bottleneck's transition sequence before she entered. Non-continuous fixed lines requiring independent clip management on near vertical ice. She acknowledged him and proceeded. The bottleneck is a narrow couloir pressed between K2's upper shoulder and a Sirac band that releases ice with no warning onto everything below. A climber 30 feet below Maris on the slope noticed her clip her ascender to the line at an angle, the cam not fully seated, before she weighted it and began moving upward. Her crampons were not biting consistently. He described her left foot skating slightly before catching. She jerked downward once as her weight shifted unevenly. Instead of stopping to reset the device, she pushed upward again, immediately. Her crampon failed to bite on the next step. She swung outward from the slope, and the ascender slipped down the rope as the cam failed to bite under load. The climber below watched her. Reach for the rope with both gloved hands. She could not hold it. A second fixed line ran approximately 2 feet to her left, and to my surprise, she was not clipped into it. She began sliding. Witnesses described the first few seconds as almost slow, as if she might still catch something. Then the angle of the slope took over. She struck a rock outcrop in the midsection of the couloir, which rotated her body and continued downward with repeated contact against ice and exposed rock. The sounds carried clearly to climbers still on the fixed lines above. Those lower on the route pressed flat against the ice as she passed. Her helmet came off somewhere in the lower visible portion of the couloir. Beyond a steep rollover at the base, she was gone. I have looked at photographs of that section of the mountain many times since researching this. There is nothing soft about it. There is nowhere to stop. A climber on the fixed line radioed base camp within minutes. A descent team attempted visual confirmation within 2 hours, but the terrain configuration and continued serac hazard above made access to the fall zone impossible. No recovery was attempted. Medical findings reconstructed from the fall path and last confirmed point of contact indicated fatal blunt force trauma to the skull and thoracic cavity, consistent with multiple high-velocity impacts against ice and rock during an uncontrolled descent of several hundred vertical feet. No equipment malfunction was identified. The ascender functioned correctly under proper use. In the months that followed, her family submitted formal removal requests to the platform hosting her account. Reposts were taken down. The account was memorialized for a time, then removed entirely. I keep thinking about the clip she filmed from that exposed rest stop below the bottleneck. Gloves on, harness visible, the drop behind her not fully registering in frame. She had built genuine confidence on a foundation that looked solid from the outside, and no one had made the difference between Everest and K to feel real to her before that morning. That distinction cost her everything, and it is worth being honest about that, even if it changes nothing now. On February 14, 2016, the Longs Peak trailhead was frigid, with strong winds at the summit and gusts expected to rise. Recent heavy snowfall had raised avalanche danger, with limited daylight and a chance of afternoon snow squalls. Juaima Hanalili pulled into the parking lot as her headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness. At 28, she had built something remarkable from nothing, a TikTok following that tuned in to watch her make the impossible seem accessible. What had started as weekend hiking posts from her Boulder apartment had evolved into her full-time career, complete with sponsorship deals and the constant pressure to produce content that would keep her audience engaged. The parking lot held only 2 other vehicles, their windshields already frosted over in the frigid air. Juaima methodically laid out her gear on the tailgate of her Subaru, the ritual familiar from dozens of previous climbs. Her 35-pound pack contained everything she might need for an emergency bivouac: sleeping bag, bivy sack, extra food, and layers upon layers of technical clothing. She had been planning this solo winter ascent of Longs Peak for 6 weeks, studying weather patterns, route conditions, and timing her attempt for the most favorable forecast window. The mountain loomed invisible in the darkness above her, its 14,259-foot summit hidden somewhere in the star-filled sky. She had climbed Longs Peak 3 times before, but never in winter, never alone, and never with the added complexity of documenting the experience for her followers. Her recent contract with a major outdoor gear company required monthly high-engagement alpine content, and winter mountaineering videos consistently performed better than her summer hiking posts. She pressed record on her phone, propping it against her bumper to capture herself with her gear spread out behind her. "Good morning, adventurers," she said quietly, mindful of the early hour. "It's Valentine's Day, and I'm about to give myself the ultimate gift, a solo winter summit of Longs Peak. The forecast looks perfect, and I've been training for this moment for months." She talked through her gear selection, explaining each piece of equipment to her audience with the enthusiasm that had made her videos so popular. The pre-recorded content would post automatically when her followers would be checking their phones over morning coffee. She shouldered her pack and began hiking into the darkness, her headlamp beam dancing across the packed but icy trail. The Longs Peak Trail was one of Colorado's most popular routes, but in February she had it almost entirely to herself. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of her microspikes on the frozen ground and the steady rhythm of her breathing in the thin air. The first 3 miles passed quickly as she warmed up, her body generating heat despite the frigid temperature. She had started fast, faster than her planned pace, but felt strong and confident. The trail was well packed from previous hikers, making navigation straightforward even in the darkness. She passed familiar landmarks, the junction with the Storm Pass Trail, the wooden bridge over Alpine Brook, the gradual steepening as the trail began its serious ascent toward treeline. She had reached approximately 11,500 feet, where the last stunted pines gave way to open alpine terrain. Dawn was breaking over the eastern plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made her pause despite the cold. The temperature had dropped to 3 degrees, and she could feel the wind for the first time, a steady presence that hadn't been noticeable in the shelter of the trees. She stopped to add her insulated jacket and switched to heavier gloves, then set up her phone to capture the sunrise with the vast expanse of Mountain National Park spread out below her. The footage was spectacular, exactly the kind of content her sponsors loved and her followers devoured. She posted it immediately, adding her location and a few encouraging words about pushing boundaries and embracing challenges. Within minutes, likes and comments began appearing, even at this early hour. Her audience was global now, and somewhere in the world, people were always awake and scrolling. The terrain above the treeline was dramatically different from the forested approach. Here, the landscape was stark and windswept, dominated by massive granite boulders and patches of wind-scoured snow. The trail became less obvious, marked primarily by cairns, stacks of rocks that guided hikers toward the technical climbing route. Juaima had studied this section extensively, but seeing it in winter conditions was different from the summer photos she had memorized. Many of the cairns were partially buried in snow, and the familiar landmarks looked alien under their white coating. She reached Boulder Field, a vast expanse of house-sized granite blocks at 12,760 feet. This was the last relatively sheltered area before the route became truly technical, and she used the opportunity to make critical gear changes. Off came her hiking boots, replaced by rigid mountaineering boots that would accept crampons. She added another insulation layer and switched to her technical shell jacket, designed to handle the wind and weather she would encounter on the exposed upper mountain. The wind had increased noticeably, sustained at around 30 miles per hour with stronger gusts that required her to brace against her trekking poles. She checked her phone and found no cellular service, expected at this elevation and location. Her GPS showed she was 30 minutes ahead of schedule, which pleased her. The faster pace would give her a buffer for the technical sections ahead and ensure she had plenty of time for the descent. She passed through the keyhole, a distinctive notch in the ridgeline that marked the transition from hiking to mountaineering. The moment she stepped through the gap, the wind hit her with full force. On the protected east side of the mountain, the wind had been manageable. Here on the exposed west face, gusts were strong enough to stagger her, and she had to lean into her ice axe for stability. The route ahead was laid out before her like a vertical roadmap. The ledges, a series of rock shelves requiring scrambling, the trough, a steep snow-filled gully, the narrows, an exposed traverse with 1,000-foot drops, and finally, the home stretch, the steep granite slabs leading to the summit. From her position at the keyhole, the summit looked deceptively close. She estimated 2.5 hours to reach the top, which would put her there well within her planned turnaround time. The ledges section required careful route finding across a series of rock shelves and short cliff bands. In summer, this was straightforward scrambling, but winter conditions had transformed it into something more serious. Snow and ice covered many of the handholds, and she had to test each placement carefully before committing her weight. The exposure was significant. A fall here would likely be fatal, but the moves were within her ability level. She paused on a particularly photogenic section to set up her phone on a small tripod, capturing footage of herself, traversing a narrow ledge with the vast landscape spread out behind her. The shot required several attempts. The wind kept knocking over her phone, and she wanted to ensure the lighting was perfect. The delay added time to her timeline, but the content would be worth it. Her followers expected high production values, and she had built her brand on delivering exactly that. She began ascending the Trough, a steep couloir that represented the most technically demanding section of the route. The gully was filled with hard-packed snow and ice, requiring her to kick steps into the slope while using her ice axe for balance and security. The angle was steep enough that a fall would be difficult to stop, but not so steep as to require ropes or advanced technical skills. The wind was funneling through the gully, creating a venturi effect that increased its speed and dropped the effective temperature to around -15 degrees. Her goggles fogged repeatedly from her exertion, forcing her to stop and clear them every few minutes. At 13,500 feet, she was breathing hard despite her excellent fitness, the thin air making every step an effort. The Trough was a place where many climbers turned back, intimidated by the exposure and technical difficulty. Juaima felt the challenge, but also felt confident in her abilities. She had trained extensively on similar terrain, and her movements were efficient and controlled. Each step was deliberate, each placement of her ice axe calculated for maximum security. She had completed the Trough and emerged onto the Narrows, a horizontal ledge traverse that was perhaps the most psychologically challenging section of the entire route. The ledge was narrow, covered in verglas, a thin coating of ice that made every step treacherous. To her left, the mountain rose in steep granite walls. To her right, the world dropped away for more than 1,000 feet to the valley floor below. The wind was violent here, unobstructed by any terrain features. Gusts hit her with enough force to threaten her balance, and she found herself crouching and waiting for lulls before moving across the more exposed sections. One particularly strong gust nearly knocked her sideways, and she pressed herself against the rock wall until it passed, her heart racing from the close call. She realized she was now behind schedule, not dangerously so, but enough to notice. The technical sections were taking longer than anticipated, partly due to conditions and partly due to her methodical approach to safety. She could see the summit plateau above her, tantalizingly close, at only 500 vertical feet away. The decision to continue felt obvious. She had come too far and invested too much to turn back now. She reached the base of the home stretch, the final pitch to the summit. In summer, this was a straightforward scramble up granite slabs. In winter, it was transformed into something more serious, with snow and ice patches covering many of the holds and obscuring the route. She could see other climbers' tracks in the snow, evidence that others had successfully completed this section in recent days. The summit plateau was visible above her, a relatively flat area that marked the end of the technical climbing. She made the decision to continue despite being 90 minutes behind her planned schedule. The weather was still holding, visibility remained good, and while the wind was strong, it wasn't getting worse. She told herself she would be quick on the summit and could make up time on the descent. The final pitch required careful route finding and precise footwork. Each move had to be calculated, each handhold tested before committing her full weight. The granite was solid, but the thin coating of ice made everything more difficult. She climbed steadily, methodically, her focus narrowed to the immediate task of finding the next secure placement. Juaima Hanalili stood on the summit of Long's Peak, achieving everything she had hoped for, a personal milestone, and content that would captivate her audience. The view was spectacular, with the entire front range of Colorado spread out below her, and the Great Plains stretching to the eastern horizon. The wind was sustained at over 40 miles per hour, but the visibility was still good, and she felt a surge of accomplishment and joy. She set up her phone to record her summit video, but the wind made filming challenging. It kept knocking over her phone, and the audio was distorted by the constant roar. She tried multiple takes, wanting to capture the moment properly for her followers. The summit video was crucial content. It would be the centerpiece of her social media posts, and likely generate significant engagement. She spent time on the summit, longer than planned but necessary to get usable footage. She ate a protein bar and drank water, trying to refuel for the descent. To the west, she noticed clouds building over the continental divide, but they still looked distant and non-threatening. The weather forecast had called for clear skies until mid-afternoon, and she felt confident she had time to descend safely. She began her descent, immediately discovering that down-climbing the home stretch was significantly more difficult than the ascent. Facing outward, she couldn't see her footholds clearly, and the angle felt steeper and more exposed. She moved very slowly, testing each placement and using her ice axe for additional security. The process was nerve-wracking and time-consuming. By the time she reached the Narrows, conditions had changed dramatically in the short time she had been on the summit. A cloud layer had moved in with surprising speed, dropping visibility to approximately 100 feet. The temperature felt like it was dropping, and the wind seemed stronger. She was beginning to feel the first signs of fatigue and cold in her fingers, despite her heavy gloves. The traverse across the Narrows in limited visibility was a different challenge entirely from the ascent. She had to move by feel and memory, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The psychological pressure was intense. She knew the exposure was there, even if she couldn't see it. Each step required complete focus and commitment. She re-entered the trough for the descent, and this was where conditions began to deteriorate rapidly. Light snow had started falling, and visibility in the couloir was now severely limited. The descent required facing into the slope and down climbing carefully, a technique more physically demanding than the ascent. Fatigue had set in, and her movements were less precise. About halfway down the trough, she dislodged a crampon placement and slid 15 feet before managing to self-arrest with her ice axe. She wasn't injured, but the incident shook her confidence and made her realize how quickly things could go wrong. She took several minutes to regain composure, checking her gear and reassessing her situation. She exited the trough and was back on the ledges, but the conditions continued to worsen. Snow was falling steadily, and the wind had increased to what felt like 50+ mile-per-hour gusts. She was shivering despite her layers and realized she was significantly behind schedule. Limited visibility and fatigue made route finding difficult, and cairns that had guided her ascent were now buried or obscured. Still navigating the ledges, she made a critical navigation error in the whiteout conditions, following what appeared to be a trail that led to a dead-end cliff band. Backtracking 200 feet cost her precious time and increased her anxiety. She now recognized she was in a serious situation, with deteriorating weather, fading daylight, and her position still far from the relative safety of the keyhole. She considered her options: continue the descent in increasingly dangerous conditions, or find shelter and wait out the storm. She decided to push for the keyhole, aiming to reach the more protected east side of the mountain to reassess and potentially continue down to treeline. Approaching the keyhole, visibility had deteriorated to near whiteout conditions. The temperature had dropped sharply, with wind chill approaching -20. She moved by memory and instinct, more than clear route finding, feeling her way across the familiar terrain. Her GPS had died in the cold, and her phone was down to 12% battery with no service. She was shivering continuously now, an early sign that her body was struggling to maintain its core temperature. The combination of exertion, altitude, and cold was taking its toll. Her decision-making was becoming impaired, though she didn't fully recognize it at the time. Civil twilight arrived, and light began fading rapidly under the storm clouds. Juaima had not reached the keyhole. In the whiteout conditions, she had become disoriented and drifted approximately 150 feet north of the correct route, now on steeper and more exposed terrain. She didn't realize her navigation error. In the limited visibility, the terrain all looked the same. She was moving very slowly, testing each step carefully, but her judgment was increasingly impaired by cold and exhaustion. The wind was constant and brutal, cutting through her layers and sapping her body heat faster than she could generate it. Full darkness arrived, and Waima was forced to rely on her headlamp. The light reflected off the falling snow, making navigation even more difficult. She was still trying to descend, but was now on unfamiliar terrain. Realizing she was lost and facing deteriorating conditions, she made a critical decision: stop moving and seek shelter until morning, or until the storm cleared. She found a small depression between boulders at high elevation on the exposed northwest face of the mountain. It wasn't the protected boulder field she had been aiming for, but it offered some shelter from the wind. The depression was just large enough to deploy her emergency bivy sack. Juaima wedged herself into the rock shelter and crawled inside the bivy with her pack. The sack provided a vapor barrier to help retain body heat, but offered limited insulation against the extreme cold. She was already hypothermic, though she didn't recognize the symptoms. Her core temperature had dropped significantly, and she was shivering violently. The wind continued at 40 to 50 miles per hour with higher gusts. And even in the partial shelter of the rocks, she couldn't fully escape its effects. The bivy sac flapped and allowed cold air infiltration, and the wind chill remained around -20 degrees. She attempted to warm herself by eating high-calorie food and drinking from her water bottle, but her water had already begun to freeze. She had approximately 800 calories of food remaining and 16 ounces of liquid water, resources that would normally be adequate for an emergency bivouac, but not in these extreme conditions. At 13,100 feet in -20-degree wind chill, her body was losing heat faster than it could generate it, even inside the bivvy. She was burning 400 to 500 calories per hour, just trying to maintain her core temperature. Several factors were working against her survival. Her base layers had absorbed sweat during the ascent and were now damp, conducting heat away from her body 25 times faster than dry clothing would have. The wind penetration through her shelter created convective heat loss, and the snow-covered rock beneath her conducted heat away from her body, despite her sleeping pad. At 13,100 feet, the air contained approximately 40% less oxygen than at sea level, making her body less efficient at generating heat and impairing her judgment. She was also becoming dehydrated as her remaining water froze, and dehydration impaired her body's ability to maintain core temperature. Juaima's core temperature dropped from 95 degrees to approximately 90 degrees, moderate hypothermia. Her violent shivering began to subside and then stopped entirely, a dangerous sign that her body was conserving energy for vital organs. She became increasingly lethargic and confused, her thinking clouded by the physiological effects of hypothermia. She attempted to use her phone several times, hoping to get a signal or at least record a message, but the device died completely due to cold-induced battery failure. The loss of her phone eliminated any possibility of calling for help or leaving a record of her location. Her core temperature continued to drop to approximately 86 degrees. Severe hypothermia. She was no longer making rational decisions, her brain function impaired by the extreme cold. She stopped trying to stay active or generate heat, instead lying still in her bivy sac as her body's systems began to shut down. Her heart rate and breathing slowed as her body entered the final stages of hypothermia. In a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, common in severe hypothermia cases, she began to feel hot and started removing clothing. She partially unzipped her bivy sac and jacket, actions that accelerated her heat loss but felt necessary to her confused mind. Her core temperature dropped below 82 degrees. Her heart developed arrhythmias as the cold affected her cardiac function. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, and she lost consciousness as her brain function deteriorated. Her heart stopped sometime during the night. The storm continued, depositing an additional 8 inches of snow that further obscured her position, already off the main route and hidden among the granite boulders of the northwest face. Juaima's parents, who had expected a call or text by the previous evening, reported her overdue to the National Park authorities. Her car was quickly located at the Longs Peak trailhead, confirming she had attempted the climb. Rangers noted the severe weather conditions that had moved through the area and began search planning, though active searching was delayed due to continued high winds and poor visibility. After weather conditions improved enough to allow safe search operations, a ground team located Juaima's body approximately 150 feet north of the standard keyhole route at 13,100 feet elevation. She was found in a small rock depression, partially covered by snow, inside her bivy sac with her jacket partially unzipped. The country coroner determined the cause of death to be hypothermia due to environmental exposure, with no traumatic injuries. The time of death was estimated during the night. The death was classified as accidental, with contributing factors including solo winter mountaineering, navigation error leading to inadequate shelter location, and being caught out after dark in severe weather conditions. It was May 12, 2018, on the upper descent ridge of a high peak in eastern Nepal at approximately 27,000 feet above sea level, a place where the atmosphere holds roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and where the margin between functional and non-functional is not measured in effort, but in minutes. Rina Solvek was 28 years old and worked as a freelance translator based in Estonia. She had taken up mountaineering 3 years earlier and had begun documenting her climbs for her TikTok. Colleagues who had climbed with her described her as physically capable, Her conditioning was genuine, her pace on lower elevations consistently strong, but easily distracted when a camera was in her hands. She had framed the expedition as both a personal milestone and a content project simultaneously, and the two goals competed for attention in ways she had not fully resolved before the ascent began. She carried a 2-camera setup alongside her standard high-altitude kit and had hired a Sherpa guide through a regional operations firm based in Kathmandu. The decision to film at the summit was not irrational in intent. She had worked toward that moment for months, and the footage captured there, the views, the wind, her own voice over it, was exactly what her audience had been following the build-up for. The problem was not filming itself. It was that at this altitude, her cognitive performance had already begun to degrade in subtle but compounding ways, leading to shortened attention span, delayed responses, and reduced awareness of time spent on secondary tasks. Oxygen management is not a background task. It requires consistent, active attention. Every pause to adjust a shot, every moment reviewing a clip instead of checking a gauge, reduced the already narrow functional margin she had remaining. Her cylinder had been calculated for a standard ascent and descent with a narrow margin. The filming introduced irregular stops that the planning did not fully account for. Her Sherpa noted during the summit sequence that her flow rate had become inconsistent and that she was beginning to respond with increasing delay when spoken to. He reminded her to monitor the gauge carefully. She acknowledged him with shortened responses and continued filming in intermittent bursts rather than continuous focus. On the early descent, he repeated instructions more firmly as her compliance became less immediate. By the time they reached the upper descent ridge, her oxygen cylinder was depleting ahead of the projected timeline, and the spare was located at a fixed cache point further down the route with travel time that could vary significantly depending on conditions, traffic, and weather. The upper descent ridge drops steeply through wind-packed snow and exposed rock, where the only sounds are the low hiss of oxygen regulators and the crunch of crampons on ice. A climber descending roughly 30 feet behind her later told investigators she had slowed noticeably around 27,000 feet, stopping twice in close succession, once to attempt another filmed segment and once to adjust her mask. Her movements were becoming less coordinated, with pauses between actions that suggested increasing cognitive lag rather than simple fatigue. Her pace did not recover after the second stop. He assumed exhaustion and maintained distance while keeping her in view. Her Sherpa checked her gauge and confirmed it was nearly empty. He immediately initiated a radio call to the lower cache point and instructed her to continue descending without stopping. Her responses were fragmented and slow, often delayed by several seconds, and at times not fully aligned with what had been asked. Her mask shifted slightly during this sequence and was not corrected immediately, further reducing oxygen delivery. Her Sherpa physically steadied her twice as her balance deteriorated. The second time, she dropped to her knees on the slope and required assistance to remain upright. Her gaze was fixed downhill, unfocused, and no longer tracking movement in a coherent way. The climber behind reached them and attempted emergency oxygen sharing through his own regulator in short intervals. The relief was brief and insufficient, providing momentary stabilization without restoring sustained function. She became unresponsive within approximately 4 minutes of going to her knees. Breathing was shallow when the radio confirmation was sent. A second guide arrived later, carrying a replacement cylinder from the lower cache point, but her condition had already progressed beyond recoverable hypoxia. No revival attempts were successful. She was declared dead in the mountain. What happened to Rena feels, in the most honest sense, like a combination of clear technical failure in judgment and a very human refusal to mentally downgrade a goal she had already invested so much into. She was clearly not untrained or unaware. She had real experience, real preparation, and competent support. But she repeatedly treated filming as something parallel to survival, rather than something that had to be fully subordinated to it at that altitude. Her family retrieved footage from her accounts in the weeks following and had it removed. The account was taken down shortly afterward. It was April 3rd, 2025, and Elena Ray Alonzo Martin stood there with her phone raised, framing the mountain behind her as she introduced her followers to the sheer scale of what she was about to attempt. But before any of that, before the climb, before the footage, before things started to go wrong, you need to understand who she was, because that context matters more than anything that comes next. Her name isn't something I'm gonna keep repeating out of respect for her family, but she was 26, she was Spanish, and she had built a decent following on TikTok doing hiking content. Think nature shots, summit selfies, that kind of stuff. She had this tough girl energy that people genuinely loved. She wasn't the polished, filtered influencer type. She was more raw, more real, and that's exactly why people connected with her. But here's the thing, before all of that, her life had kind of fallen apart. About 2 years before Everest, she went through a really rough patch. Her long-term relationship ended, and not in a clean way. She had cheated on her boyfriend, he found out, and he left. And then, almost like the universe was piling on, she lost her job around the same time. For close to 2 years after that, by all accounts from people who knew her, she was kind of just drifting. No clear direction, no real purpose. And I'm not saying any of that to judge her. Honestly, I think a lot of us have been in some version of that place, where you don't really know who you are or what you're supposed to be doing. It's a genuinely uncomfortable place to sit in. What pulled her out of it eventually was the mountains and TikTok. She started hiking. She started, seriously, filming it, posting it, and the response gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. Identity, direction. People called her brave, inspiring. After 2 years of feeling lost, that kind of feedback is powerful, maybe even addictive. Here's where you need to pay attention, because this part gets overlooked. Her content followed a clear escalation pattern. She started with Picos de Europa, beautiful, manageable mountains in northern Spain. Then Montserrat, the jagged range in Catalonia. Then Sierra Nevada, higher elevation, more demanding. Each step felt natural, even impressive. Her followers grew, the praise got louder, but there was something hiding in plain sight. She had no real technical training. Her gear was functional, but not what serious mountaineers would call appropriate. She was leveling up the mountains without leveling up the skills, and her followers didn't see that. They saw the views, the confidence, the aesthetic. Nobody asked about her, a technique. They just told her she was incredible, that she should keep going. Exactly what she likely wanted to hear. That feedback loop is dangerous. I think about it a lot, even with my own channel. The audience rewards the result, not the process. And sometimes, the process gets skipped. This is the moment I keep coming back to, the turning point. In Sierra Nevada, she was filming. She left the marked trail to get a better angle. That's such a TikTok thing, right? The shot matters more than the path. So she climbed onto an unstable rock section for the perfect frame. She slipped, she slid. She stopped herself at the last second. The injury was minor, cuts and bruises, but it was real, a genuine scare. Her body had just told her clearly that she made a dangerous call, and what did she do? She posted it, laughed it off on camera. The video did well. People thought it was funny, thought it proved how tough she was. And that moment, right there, reframed a near disaster into a personality trait. She falls and laughs. She's fearless. But fearless and reckless aren't the same. In Sierra Nevada, she learned the wrong lesson. Not, I need training, but I can handle it. The TikTok metrics agreed. The mountain eventually would not. According to her friends, it happened late at night. She was scrolling TikTok when she saw a video about climbing Everest. We don't know what was in it. Maybe a summit shot, maybe someone else's triumph, but it clearly hit something deep. She reposted it. That sounds like nothing. People repost things all the time. But here's the detail that made this particular repost so haunting. After her death, when people started going back through her account trying to understand her, they found that out of everything she had ever shared or reposted on TikTok, that Everest video was the only repost on her entire account. Think about that for a second. She saw one video, she shared it, and then she started making plans. I'm not saying TikTok killed her, that's too simple, but I do think that one late night scroll session planted a seed in someone who was already hungry for the next peak, the next milestone, the next story to tell. Okay, so this is important because a lot of people assume that climbing Everest requires years of documented mountaineering experience and some intense vetting process. And while that's true for the most demanding, self-supported expeditions, there's another side to this industry that doesn't get talked about enough. She didn't go rogue. She didn't sneak onto the mountain. She booked a commercial Everest expedition. Her parents, who were described as financially comfortable, helped fund it. And we're talking real money here. These packages typically run somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000, depending on the company and what's included. And here's the uncomfortable truth about some of these commercial operations. If you can pay, you can go. Not all of them. There are reputable guiding companies with strict experience requirements, but there are also others that, let's be honest, are running a business. They provide Sherpas, oxygen tanks, fixed ropes along the established route, and base camp support. And for that price tag, some of them are willing to bring along clients who don't exactly have a resume full of high-altitude climbs. So she got a permit, she got access, she had a Sherpa assigned to her. On paper, she was doing everything right. What she didn't have was the experience. The kind of experience that doesn't show up on a booking form. The kind that lives in your body, in your lungs, in your muscles, in the way your brain functions at 26,000 feet, when it's getting a fraction of the oxygen it normally needs. You can buy your way onto the mountain. You cannot buy your way into being ready for it. When she met her assigned Sherpa at base camp on Mount Everest, it became clear pretty quickly that there was a mismatch. Sherpas are not just mountain guides in the basic sense. These are people who have lived at altitude their whole lives, often in villages above 10,000 feet, who have summited Everest multiple times, and who understand the mountain in a way that goes beyond training. They read weather shifts in the wind, instability in the ice, and exhaustion in a climber's posture before it's ever spoken out loud. Everest Base Camp itself sits at roughly 17,600 feet, already higher than most mountains in Europe. Even standing there, doing nothing, your body is under stress. Oxygen levels are about half of what they are at sea level. People lose their appetite. Sleep becomes shallow. Headaches are common before the climb has even really started. And above base camp is the Khumbu Icefall, a constantly shifting maze of ice towers and deep crevasses that climbers have to cross using ladders and fixed ropes. It's one of the most dangerous sections of the entire route. Not because it's technically complex, but because it's alive. It moves. Her Sherpa noticed immediately. She was inexperienced. She was confident in a way that didn't match what he was seeing. Later, people who knew him reconstructed the general shape of their early conversations. And what came through was that he raised questions about her preparation and her background early on. Her response essentially was to reassure him. She had done mountains before. She was fit. She could handle it. I want to be really clear here. This isn't a story about a villain. Her Sherpa was doing his job, doing it well, and trying to look out for someone in his care. And she wasn't lying. She had done mountains before. She just didn't fully grasp the difference between the mountains she had done and the one she was standing at the base of. Everest isn't just taller. It exists in what climbers call the death zone, above 26,000 feet, where the human body literally cannot acclimatize. Every step higher is a slow deterioration. That gap in understanding is, I think, one of the saddest parts of this whole thing. The early sections of an Everest climb are physically brutal in a way that's hard to describe if you've never experienced high altitude, and she struggled. Early on, moving through the Khumbu Icefall and into Camp 1, she was having trouble breathing at a pace that would have been routine for more experienced climbers. Even simple movements, stepping over a ladder spanning a crevasse, clipping into a rope, require focus when your brain is already oxygen deprived. Her Sherpa slowed everything down to accommodate her, which is actually standard practice. But it was a clear early signal. Beyond that, the route opens into the western CWM, a wide glacier valley that looks deceptively calm. It's often described as a solar oven. The sunlight reflects off the surrounding ice walls and snow, trapping heat. Climbers can overheat during the day and then face freezing temperatures just hours later. It's physically disorienting. Hot, cold, dehydrated, exhausted, all at once. And that kind of stress compounds fast if your body isn't adapting. Then, higher up toward Camp 2 and beyond, it got worse. She developed a headache. Not a, I need some water and an aspirin headache. The kind that settles behind your eyes and doesn't leave. Nausea followed. Then a kind of full-body weakness that altitude sickness produces in people whose bodies aren't adapting well to the thin air. At those elevations, this isn't just discomfort. It's the early stages of something that can turn fatal. High-altitude cerebral or pulmonary edema, where the brain or lungs begin to swell. Her body was sending every distress signal it had. The mountain was communicating clearly, and I think part of her knew, because how could she not, that something was wrong. But here's where the TikTok piece comes back in, and this is the part that really gets to me. At some point during the climb, likely somewhere above Camp 2, as they prepared to push higher toward the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that requires fixed ropes and precise footing, she insisted on going live. This is a detail that sticks with me. She set up her phone, she went on TikTok live, and for about 2 minutes she talked to her followers. Behind her was one of the harshest environments on Earth. Temperatures well below freezing, winds that can pick up without warning, and air so thin that even speaking in full sentences costs energy. She looked energetic. She talked about how amazing it was, how beautiful the view was, how grateful she felt. The comments were almost certainly going wild, people cheering her on, heart emojis and fire emojis and "you've got this" from thousands of people who had no idea what her body was actually going through, what that altitude does to your blood oxygen, your coordination, your judgment. And then the live stream ended, and she was immediately exhausted. That 2-minute performance had cost her something. Up there, energy isn't just fatigue, it's survival. Every unnecessary movement, every extra breath, every moment spent not conserving strength adds up. And from what people reconstructed afterward, it was shortly after this that her Sherpa made a direct recommendation to turn back. He had been watching her. He had seen what the live stream concealed. He knew what the climb still ahead of them demanded. The push through the death zone, the summit, and more importantly, the descent. She said no. She wanted to keep going. Her reasoning, as best as people could piece it together later, came down to 3 things: her followers, proving herself, and pride. She had come this far. She had told everyone she was doing this. Turning back on Everest isn't just a physical decision, it's psychological. It feels like failure, even though in reality, turning back is one of the most respected decisions a climber can make. But in that moment, standing on a mountain where the margin for error is almost zero, she chose to keep going. And I genuinely understand that feeling, even as I wish she had made a different call. When your identity is built on the content you create, turning back from a summit feels like erasing yourself. As they pushed higher, the weather started shifting. Conditions on Everest can change with almost no warning, and what had been a manageable climb was becoming something more serious. Her Sherpa, by multiple accounts, strongly advised stopping. He was direct about the risk. He specifically pointed to her physical condition, the altitude sickness symptoms, the exhaustion, the pace she had been keeping, and told her that continuing in that state was genuinely dangerous. She chose to continue, and here's the thing that makes this story so complicated. She actually reached the summit, against everything her body was telling her, against the weather, against the advice of someone who knew that mountain better than almost anyone on Earth. She made it to the top of Everest. She filmed it. She was emotional and triumphant, and she hugged her Sherpa, and she stood at the highest point on the planet. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's important. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't just someone who stumbled onto the mountain without any capability whatsoever. She made it to the summit of Everest. That's real. That happened. But summiting Everest is only half the story, and it's not the half that kills people. The majority of deaths on Everest don't happen on the way up. They happen on the way down. And this is something that a lot of people, including it seems a lot of people who book commercial expeditions without sufficient experience, don't fully internalize until they're in it. Here's why the descent is so deadly. By the time you reach the summit, you have burned through enormous amounts of energy, you're operating on low oxygen, your body is breaking down, and your brain, the thing you need to make good decisions and maintain physical coordination, is functioning at a reduced level, and then you have to navigate back down the same terrain that challenged you on the way up. Except now you're operating at a fraction of your capacity. For her, by the time the descent began, she was running on empty in every way that mattered, completely exhausted, mentally drained. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Her reactions were slow. The fatal moment happened on a narrow, exposed section of the descent route. She misstepped, just slightly, caught her foot wrong, lost her footing on the hard, glassy ice. In that instant, there was a pause, the kind where your body is supposed to correct itself automatically, but it didn't, because her reaction time was gone, stripped down by exhaustion, by oxygen deprivation, by hours of cumulative strain. She couldn't stabilize the way a rested, experienced climber might have been able to. She slid, a short, uncontrolled shift at first, then her center of gravity tipped past the point of recovery, and she fell. The terrain on that section of Everest doesn't give you anything back. There's no forgiving slope, no rough surface to grab onto. Nothing like the Sierra Nevada slip she once walked away from. It just drops, steep, cold, absolute. Her Sherpa, who had been tracking every step she took on the descent and staying within reach, reacted immediately. But even immediate isn't fast enough when gravity takes over on that kind of terrain. She was gone before any real rescue attempt could be mounted. At that altitude, in those conditions, above 26,000 feet, where helicopters can't reliably operate, where even standing still for too long drains the body. There was no window, no second chance, no realistic intervention. The mountain doesn't pause. It doesn't allow for it. The expedition team recovered what they could and documented the incident the way these situations are formally handled on Everest, with a kind of clinical efficiency that feels brutal, but is really just the reality of what that mountain demands of everyone on it. Back online, her parents took her TikTok account offline, but before they did, the internet had already found what it was looking for. Her followers grew after her death. One of those deeply uncomfortable patterns of social media that says something uncomfortable about how we consume tragedy. And people going back through her content found two things: the Everest repost, sitting alone as the only thing she had ever shared from someone else's account, and the old risky content, the Sierra Nevada slip, the moments where she had laughed off things that shouldn't have been laughed off. Her Sherpa, in an interview afterward, said that she was determined, and that determination is not the same as experience. He also said that he had warned her about the descent specifically, because that is where people don't realize how dangerous Everest really is. Her mother said that her daughter had finally found something that gave her peace, and then she said that she just wished it wasn't that mountain. This isn't a story about TikTok being evil. It's a story about what happens when the feedback you get from the internet starts to feel more trustworthy than the feedback you get from your own body, your own preparation, and the people who actually know what they're talking about. Everest is not a trend. It's not a TikTok challenge. It's not the next level after Sierra Nevada. It requires years of progressively harder climbs, technical training, physical preparation, and a level of respect for the environment that goes way beyond any number of followers or any amount of money. It was April 18th, 2015. On a narrow shelf above Camp 2 in the Annapurna region of Nepal, where the upper snowfields hold their shape for weeks and then release all of it in under a minute. And the difference between those two states is invisible until it is not. Tessa Michaels was 24 years old, from Auckland, New Zealand. She had worked retail for 3 years before taking a year off to travel through Southeast Asia and into the Himalayas. She had a modest but growing TikTok following built around what she called hidden camp spots, locations chosen for their visual payoff, photographed at the best light, framed for the best angle. She was not a technical mountaineer. She had joined a guided group to reach Camp 2, and by all accounts, she was enthusiastic. Unfortunately for her, enthusiasm doesn't do much in one of the world's deadliest peaks. She had set her tent roughly 1,000 feet from the group's designated camp, beneath a wide-open snow face that offered an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon at sunrise. She moved her tent there after the group had already established camp, carrying part of her gear herself in 2 trips. A guide had walked to her position the previous afternoon and told her directly that the slope above was avalanche-prone, particularly as daytime temperatures rose and the snowpack cycled through freeze-thaw stress. She acknowledged what he said. However, she did not move. Imagine a direct warning from someone whose job it is to keep you alive, and you still didn't follow. The weather was clear. The snow at her feet was firm. From where she stood, nothing looked wrong. She filmed the sunset from that position. She was still there at first light, but overnight temperatures had fluctuated, and the upper snowpack, loosened by the previous day's warmth and refrozen unevenly, had entered a condition experienced guides describe as structurally unreliable. A slab resting on a weakened layer beneath it, waiting for a trigger that might arrive or might not. The upper face above her tent stretched nearly 400 feet wide in the gray pre-dawn. A climber from the main camp, moving out early around 5:40 a.m., noticed thin, loose snow sliding off the face above her tent. The kind of minor surface movement that can mean nothing or can mean the slope is beginning to talk. He stopped to watch. Then, roughly 60 feet higher and further left across the face, a fracture line opened. It ran clean and straight across the width of the upper slope. The slab below it began to move. He shouted in her direction, but the distance was too great. The wind was carrying his voice away from her position and into the open valley. A second team member near the camp entrance also shouted. Neither warning likely reached her. The avalanche, dense, heavy spring snow mixed with compacted ice, accelerated down the open face and covered the distance to her position in well under half a minute from fracture. She had exited her tent. She was standing beside it, phone in hand, facing upslope. Both witnesses described her turning toward the sound before the flow reached her. The snow hit her at the knees and she went down immediately. The debris, moving at an estimated 30 to 40 miles per hour at impact, rolled over her in a mass that witnesses described as heavy rather than explosive. Not a wall, but a weight. Her tent collapsed. Part of it was carried downslope. Her arm was visible above the surface for a brief moment, pressing upward against the compacting snow before the settling debris covered it completely. The slope went quiet. I don't think the word buried captures what actually happens. the snow compacts immediately. It sets like concrete. The alarm was raised within seconds. The team leader called for mountain rescue and moved toward the debris field within 2 minutes. Avalanche probes and transceivers were deployed across the zone. Tessa was located after roughly 20 minutes, at a depth of about 3 feet beneath the surface. Extraction through the compacted debris took additional time. She was dead when recovered. Her pre-scheduled social media posts, clips of the campsite, the sunset, the slope she had positioned herself to film, continued uploading automatically for several hours after the avalanche. Followers left confused, cheerful comments beneath footage of the face that had killed her before teammates reported the account. The posts were eventually taken down by the platform after the incident. Exit was reported. She had every opportunity to not be in that location. The guide told her. She understood. She made a judgment based on conditions that looked stable from where she was standing. And that is an understandable decision. It is also the decision that killed her. Those two things can be true at the same time, and sitting with that is harder than anything else in this story. It was June 12th, 2016, and Maya Rodriguez sat in her Los Angeles apartment, scrolling through her phone after an evening fitness session. At 31 years old, she had built a modest following of 180,000 on Instagram by posting fitness content, marathon training updates, and motivational quotes overlaid on photos of herself mid-workout. The algorithm had been generous that evening, serving her a TikTok video that had gone viral across multiple platforms. An amateur climber standing on what appeared to be the summit of Mount Everest, arms raised in triumph, with a caption suggesting that anyone with determination could achieve the same feat. Maya watched the video 3 times. The climber in the footage had no apparent sponsorships, no elite athletic background mentioned in the bio, just a regular person who had decided to climb the world's tallest mountain and succeeded. The comment section overflowed with praise and declarations from viewers promising they would attempt their own climbs. Maya screenshot the video and spent the next 2 hours researching high-altitude mountaineering. Her fitness background was legitimate within its context. She had completed 6 marathons with respectable times, maintained a rigorous strength training schedule, and possessed the cardiovascular endurance that came from years of disciplined exercise. What she did not possess was any technical climbing experience beyond a single weekend rock climbing course she had taken 4 years earlier at an indoor gym. She had never used crampons on ice, never climbed above 10,000 feet, and never spent a night in temperatures below freezing. The research she conducted that evening did not fill these gaps. Instead, it reinforced a belief that physical fitness and mental toughness could substitute for experience. Over the following week, Maya's search history revealed a pattern of misunderstanding about high-altitude mountaineering. She searched for the easiest 8,000-meter peaks and found articles listing mountains by technical difficulty. Everest appeared frequently, but was described as overcrowded and expensive. K2 appeared in several articles as more challenging, but with fewer commercial expeditions and lower permit costs. What Maya absorbed from these articles was that K2 was less crowded, not that it was statistically more dangerous than Everest, with a summit-to-fatality ratio that had historically hovered near 25%. She contacted 6 expedition companies by email, describing her fitness background and requesting information about joining a K2 expedition that summer. 5 companies responded with polite rejections or recommendations that she first gain experience on lower peaks like Aconcagua, Denali, or at minimum, a 6,000-meter trekking peak in Nepal. The 6th company, a small Pakistani outfit based in Islamabad, responded with a quote of $72,000 and a questionnaire asking about her insurance coverage and medical history. The questionnaire did not ask about prior climbing experience in any specific detail. Maya interpreted the company's willingness to accept her as validation that her fitness level was sufficient. She paid the deposit on June 18th and received a gear list 3 days later. The list included items she had never heard of: ascenders, Prusik loops, glacier glasses with specific UV protection ratings, and down suits rated for extreme cold. She spent $9,000 at an outdoor retailer in Los Angeles, relying on sales staff recommendations for equipment selection because she did not understand the differences between models or temperature ratings. When the employee asked about her prior climbs to help select appropriate gear, Maya mentioned her marathon experience and said she was preparing for a high-altitude expedition. The employee did not ask which mountain. Maya departed for Pakistan on June 24, 2016, and arrived in Islamabad on June 26th after a connecting flight through Dubai. The expedition leader, a Pakistani guide named Tariq Hussain, met her and 3 other clients at the hotel for an initial briefing. The other clients had varying experience levels. One had summited Everest, another had attempted K2 previously and turned back at Camp 3, and the third had multiple 6,000-meter summits across the Andes and Himalayas. When introductions were made, Maya and Tariq asked about her climbing background. She described her fitness routine and mentioned she had researched high-altitude physiology extensively over the past 2 weeks. Tariq's expression suggested concern, but the payment had already cleared, and the liability waiver she had signed in Los Angeles was comprehensive. The approach to K2 base camp took 6 days of trekking from Oscole through the Baltoro Glacier, and Maya struggled more than anticipated. The trail demanded sustained hiking at elevations between 10,000 and 16,000 feet while carrying a day pack, with porters managing the heavier loads. By the 3rd day, Maya experienced persistent headaches and nausea that she attributed to dehydration rather than altitude. When she mentioned this to Tariq during an evening meal, he explained that her symptoms matched classic acute mountain sickness and that her body needed more time to adjust to the elevation. Maya responded that she would feel better once they stopped moving and established base camp. They reached K2 base camp on June 28th at 16,400 feet, where temperatures hovered near freezing even in direct sunlight, and wind tore across the Godwin-Austen Glacier, with enough force to require anchoring tents with heavy rocks and buried gear. The camp sprawled across a rocky moraine, with approximately 35 climbers from 5 different expeditions preparing for potential summit windows in July. Prayer flags stretched between tent clusters, snapping violently in gusts that carried the smell of kerosene from camp stoves and the sharp ozone scent of glacial ice. Maya was assigned to work with Verba Charing, a 41-year-old Sherpa from Kumjung village in Nepal's Khumbu region. Verba had worked as a high-altitude guide for 19 years and had summited K2 4 times and Everest 9 times, placing him among the more experienced Sherpa guides working in the Karakoram. He was known within the climbing community as patient with inexperienced clients, but firm about safety protocols and turnaround times, especially on mountains where margins for error were thin. His income from guiding supported his wife, 4 children, and his elderly mother, whose respiratory issues required ongoing medical care that consumed a significant portion of his annual earnings. The expedition company had hired Verba specifically for Maya after Tariq expressed concerns about her lack of experience. The plan called for Verba to provide one-on-one support throughout the climb, focusing exclusively on Maya while other Sherpas worked with the remaining clients. When Verba first met Maya in the mess tent on June 29th, he asked about her prior climbs to understand her technical skill level. Maya described her fitness background and mentioned she had been training intensely. Verba clarified by asking specifically about ice climbing, crampon use, and fixed rope ascent techniques. Maya acknowledged she had no practical experience with those skills, but said she learned quickly and had watched instructional videos. Verba spent the afternoon teaching Maya basic crampon techniques on a small ice slope near camp. The lesson revealed significant gaps in her coordination and understanding. She crossed her feet while traversing, a dangerous habit that could cause her to trip over her own crampons. Her ice axe technique was tentative and incorrect, and she did not understand the difference between French technique and front pointing. After 2 hours, Verba had covered material that experienced climbers learned during multi-day courses, and he recognized that Maya's learning curve would not flatten quickly enough to make her safe on K2's technical terrain. That evening, Verba spoke privately with Tariq about his concerns. Maya's lack of experience meant she was not simply inexperienced, she was unqualified for K2 by any reasonable standard. The mountain demanded technical proficiency on steep ice, sustained effort in the death zone above 26,000 feet, and decision-making capacity under severe hypoxia. Tariq acknowledged the concerns, but noted that Maya had signed extensive liability waivers and that the company had accepted her payment with the understanding she was climbing at her own risk. Verba understood the economics that governed these decisions, even when they conflicted with safety. The first briefing occurred on July 1st, when Tariq gathered all expedition members to review the route, acclimatization schedule, and objective hazards. He explained that K2's weather windows were narrower and less predictable than Everest's, that rescue above Camp 3 was extremely difficult, and that turnaround times existed specifically to prevent climbers from descending in darkness, when exhaustion and hypoxia made fatal errors more likely. Maya attended the briefing with her phone positioned to record video, and she interrupted twice to ask Tariq to repeat sections because she had been filming rather than listening. When Furba explained the importance of efficient movement through dangerous terrain, like the bottleneck, a steep couloir beneath a massive hanging serac, where speed reduced exposure to collapse, Maya asked whether they could pause during that section so she could capture footage. Furba explained patiently that stopping in objective hazard zones increased risk for everyone on the mountain, not just her. Maya responded that her followers expected content throughout the climb, and she needed to document key sections. The first acclimatization rotation began on July 3rd, with a climb from base camp to Camp 1 at approximately 19,700 feet. The route ascended steep scree and ice slopes for nearly 3,000 vertical feet, and most experienced climbers completed the climb in 4 to 5 hours. Maya required 7 hours and 15 minutes. Furba stayed with her throughout, watching her struggle with terrain that should have felt manageable for someone attempting K2. Her breathing became labored within the first hour, and she stopped frequently to rest even on moderate slopes. Her crampon technique remained poor despite the previous day's practice, and twice she caught her front points on her opposite pant leg and nearly lost balance. At Camp 1, Furba checked Maya's oxygen saturation using his pulse oximeter. The reading showed 76%, which fell within acceptable range for acclimatization, but was lower than ideal for someone at this early stage. He asked about her hydration and whether she had experienced headaches or nausea during the climb. Maya acknowledged a mild headache, but said she felt strong overall. Her self-assessment did not match what Furba had observed during the ascent. They descended to base camp that afternoon, and Maya spent the evening editing video footage on her laptop. The content she posted later showed dramatic angles of the route and brief clips of herself climbing, but did not mention Furba or acknowledge the extended time required to complete what should have been a straightforward acclimatization rotation. Other Sherpas at base camp mentioned seeing her posts and noted the pattern that many clients followed, documenting their own achievement while rendering their guides invisible. The second rotation to Camp 2, at approximately 21,300 feet, began on July 6th. The route required crossing a steep ice face and navigating crevasse fields, gaining roughly 1,600 vertical feet from Camp 1. Maya's performance deteriorated noticeably. Her pace slowed to 30 steps, followed by extended rest breaks, her breathing rapid and shallow even during pauses. Furba monitored her closely and noted that her coordination seemed impaired. She fumbled with carabiner gaits, struggled to clip into fixed ropes efficiently, and moved with the kind of clumsiness that suggested her body was not adapting well to altitude. At Camp 2, Maya appeared exhausted in ways that concerned Furba beyond normal acclimatization fatigue. Her face remained flushed despite the cold. Her speech came slowly, and she sat down in the snow without organizing her gear or helping to prepare the tent. Furba checked her oxygen saturation and found it had dropped to 72%. He explained carefully that declining numbers suggested her body was struggling to adjust, and that continuing upward with deteriorating acclimatization increased the risk of pulmonary or cerebral edema. Maya's response was immediate. She had paid $72,000 and trained hard for this climb. Other expedition members were continuing their rotations on schedule, and she expected the same support. Furba attempted to explain that oxygen saturation measurements were objective physiological data, unrelated to determination or payment. But Maya ended the conversation by stating she would discuss any concerns with Tariq directly. That evening, Maya radioed base camp to complain that Furba was being overly cautious and undermining her confidence. Tariq supported Furba's assessment, but noted that the final decision to continue belonged to Maya as long as she remained physically capable and understood the risks. The compromise involved an additional rest day at Camp 2 before attempting Camp 3. The climb to Camp 3 on July 10th exposed the full extent of Maya's inadequacy. The route ascended a steep section of the Abruzzi Spur, requiring sustained climbing on fixed ropes over blue ice and rock at angles approaching 50 degrees. Maya required 9 hours and 40 minutes to reach Camp 3 at 23,300 feet. Furba remained with her throughout, watching her stop every 25 feet, her legs trembling between efforts, her breathing so labored she appeared to be hyperventilating. Around 22,800 feet, Maya stopped moving for nearly 15 minutes without explanation. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, staring at the slope above her without attempting to climb. When Furba asked if she could continue, her response came slowly and without the sharpness that had characterized earlier interactions. The delayed processing matched cognitive slowdown Furba had seen in clients developing serious hypoxia. At Camp 3, Maya collapsed into her tent without helping to organize gear. Furba checked her oxygen saturation and found it had dropped to 68% without supplemental oxygen, a concerning sign given the relatively short time spent at that altitude. He radioed Tariq immediately and stated that Maya needed to descend. Her oxygen levels, combined with confusion and coordination, problems suggested early cerebral edema, and waiting for symptoms to worsen would make descent impossible. Tariq asked to speak with Maya directly. The radio conversation occurred with Furba present, and Maya insisted she felt fine, despite obvious evidence otherwise. She acknowledged the climb had been difficult, but attributed this to normal altitude effects. She planned to rest and descend the following morning as part of the standard rotation cycle. Tariq accepted this plan with the condition that Furba monitor her closely overnight and initiate immediate descent if her condition worsened. Maya descended the next day, but the following week at base camp revealed she had not recovered. She lost visible weight, moved slowly between tents, and showed fatigue that rest did not improve. Furba raised concerns with Tariq twice more, but each time Tariq deferred to Maya's insistence on continuing, citing acceptable oxygen readings at base camp and the absence of acute symptoms. The weather window opened on July 18th. Forecasts predicted a brief period of reduced winds and clear skies beginning July 20th. Expeditions across base camp finalized summit plans, and Maya insisted on joining despite showing no improvement in her physical condition. If anything, she appeared weaker than during previous rotations, but her determination remained fixed. The push towards summit began on July 19th. Maya moved through the lower camps on depleted reserves, her pace mechanical and her focus distant. At Camp 4 at 26,000 feet on July 20th, Furba checked her oxygen saturation one final time before the summit push. With her mask sealed and flow set at 4 liters per minute, her reading hovered at 65%. Dangerously low and indicating her body was barely processing oxygen even with supplemental support. Furba made his final attempt to prevent what he knew would happen. He sat beside Maya in her tent while wind hammered the fabric and explained what the numbers meant. Her body was not adapting. The summit remained 3,000 vertical feet above them, and every step higher would worsen her hypoxia. If cerebral swelling progressed, she could lose coordination and consciousness above 27,000 feet, where rescue was impossible. He asked her directly to descend while she still possessed the physical capacity. Maya's response came without hesitation. She had invested $72,000 and trained for months. She had followers expecting summit content. She was continuing, and Furba could either support that decision or she would request different support. The threat was delivered calmly, which made it more disturbing than anger would have. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on July 20th. Maya climbed with Furba directly ahead, and a younger assistant Sherpa, Dawa, behind. Temperatures with wind chill dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but skies remained clear and winds manageable. For the first 2 hours, Maya maintained pace on the fixed ropes, her oxygen flowing at 4 liters per minute and her layers holding warmth. Above 27,000 feet, deterioration became undeniable. Maya's rest stops extended from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, then longer. Her responses to simple questions slowed and arrived incomplete, as if her brain needed extra time to assemble basic thoughts. Her breathing developed a wet, rattling quality that suggested fluid was accumulating in her lungs as effort and altitude overwhelmed her respiratory system. By 28,000 feet, with roughly 1,250 vertical feet remaining to the summit, Maya had stopped making meaningful progress. She would climb 20 feet, then stop for 5 minutes or longer, her head dropping as if she were falling asleep while standing. Other climbers passed them where terrain allowed, and the turnaround time Furba had established, 2 a.m. regardless of position, came and went while they remained far below the summit. Furba told Maya they were turning around immediately. She did not respond. He repeated the warning with greater urgency, but Maya showed little comprehension. When he stepped in front of her to block the route upward, she pushed past him with uncoordinated strength, her movements impulsive and erratic. Furba and Dawa tried to physically turn her around, guiding her hands to the lower rope and setting her boots into the descent track. But she resisted and continued climbing upward, fixated on reaching the summit. What followed was nearly an hour of struggle with a client who had ceased rational function. They could not carry her down against her will without risking all three falling. They could not restrain her without turning a steep fixed rope route into a fight for balance. They could not call for rescue because helicopter operations were impossible at that altitude. At approximately 3:15 a.m., Maya unclipped her safety tether from the short rope connecting her to Furba, and clipped only to the fixed line. She continued climbing alone, moving slowly upward while Furba shouted warnings that the wind carried away. Furba followed at a distance, unable to abandon a client, but unable to physically prevent her from continuing. His own hypoxia was worsening, and Dawa was showing signs of exhaustion that suggested they were approaching their own limits. At 28,400 feet, Maya collapsed. She sat down in the snow and did not stand back up. Furba reached her within minutes and found her unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body unresponsive to verbal commands or physical stimulation. Her oxygen mask had slipped partially off her face, and her regulator showed flow, but the seal was broken. He reseated the mask and increased the flow rate, waiting for any sign of improvement. None came. Within minutes, her breathing became faint and difficult to detect. Furba checked for a pulse through thick gloves, but could not find one he trusted. At 28,400 feet, judgment blurred by exhaustion and hypoxia, certainty was impossible. What he knew was that she was no longer responding, no longer assisting, and no longer able to descend under her own power. He made the only decision he could. Clipping her harness to his own, he began attempting to lower her down the fixed lines in short, controlled sections. If there was any chance she was still alive, descent was the only treatment that mattered. Her body hung slack against the rope system, offering no help with foot placements or balance. The effort required strength the altitude had already stripped from him, and after 15 minutes, he had moved her less than 50 feet. Her limbs remained limp. Her chest showed no visible movement. His own vision began to narrow, and he understood that continuing much longer would mean 3 bodies on the slope instead of 1. During one transition between anchor points, Furba's crampon caught on the fixed rope buried under fresh snow. The sudden resistance pitched him sideways, and he fell violently onto the slope, his hip striking rock beneath the snow with enough force that he felt something give. Pain detonated through his left side as he slid briefly before the rope arrested his fall. He tried to stand but could not. His left leg would not bear weight, and any attempt to move sent sharp waves through his pelvis and knee. Dawa reached him and radioed again for help. Hours later, as summit teams began descending from above, 2 Sherpas encountered them by chance and stopped. They checked Maya directly, removing her glove, clearing frost from her face, and assessing for pulse and breath without the distortion of panic or motion. There were none. They confirmed what the mountain had already decided. Maya Rodriguez had died high on the slope of K2, most likely from advanced high-altitude cerebral edema, compounded by hypothermia in -40-degree conditions. Furba's injuries required immediate evacuation, and the decision was made to focus on getting the living down before the weather deteriorated. The descent took 11 brutal hours over steep technical terrain. Furba was lowered to base camp, then airlifted to Skardu, and transferred to Islamabad for emergency surgery. Doctors confirmed a complex hip fracture and severe ligament damage that ended his high-altitude guiding career permanently. Months later, he returned to Nepal and opened a small trekking lodge using compensation and community support. Maya's body remained on K2, recovery deemed too dangerous at that altitude, as her final post from Camp 4, uploaded hours before the summit push, showed her smiling in her down suit. It received more than 240,000 interactions. It was May 19th, 2018, on the southeast ridge of the world's highest mountain, at roughly 27,500 feet above sea level, where three women began the final hours of their lives, not fully understanding what kind of place they had walked into. Lyra Donev was 24 years old and worked as a lifestyle content creator based in Portland, Oregon. She had built a modest following through short-form challenge videos, eating contests, cold plunge reactions, overnight wilderness stays with rented gear. She was energetic, commercially minded, and genuinely talented at turning ordinary moments into shareable content. Together, the three of them had begun approaching each outing less as an experience and more as a coordinated production, openly framing even mundane risks as usable material, sometimes with a detached, almost mocking awareness that everything was ultimately just content. Mika Solin, 22, was an aspiring creator who had attached herself to Lyra's orbit 6 months earlier, chasing the same audience. Tess Arlo, 23, was a photographer who had begun monetizing adventure experiences, less interested in followers than in licensing her footage to outdoor brands. None of them had prior high-altitude mountaineering experience beyond a guided Kilimanjaro ascent. They trained physically, cardio, strength, altitude tents, but not technically. They relied entirely on their Sherpa, Pemba Nuru, for logistics. Pemba had guided the mountain for 11 seasons and reached the summit 7 times. He had warned the group repeatedly that filming above Camp 4 would compress their safety margin dangerously. They acknowledged this and continued filming anyway. The southeast ridge above 26,000 feet sits inside what mountaineers call the death zone, an altitude where the human body cannot acclimatize and begins consuming itself. At that elevation, air contains roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Supplemental oxygen extends the window of safe function, but it does not neutralize the zone. It delays the consequences of being in it. Most guided teams hold a hard turnaround of 1 p.m. to ensure descent in daylight with functioning oxygen. The summit push began at 11:45 p.m. on May 18th, already behind schedule. Between Camp 4 and the balcony, the group stopped repeatedly for filming. Mika removed her oxygen mask multiple times for cleaner audio. Lyra called retakes of walking segments. By sunrise, they had not yet reached the balcony, and traffic from other summit teams was stacking above them. Still, they were attempting to film a lighthearted, high-energy summit morning routine segment, almost comedic content at the top of the world. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Tess began showing signs of hypoxia. Pemba later told investigators her speech had become slow and slurred, and her response time to direct questions had extended to several seconds. She continued adjusting her camera. Lyra then set up a shot requiring Mika to walk a short section without her mask. Mika attempted to comply, stumbled, and dropped to her knees in the snow. Her hands were shaking visibly. She struggled to reseal the regulator coupling with fingers that had already lost fine motor function. Pemba moved toward her. Lyra told him to wait 30 seconds. He did not wait. By the time he reached Mika and pressed the mask back against her face, her breathing had shifted, rapid and shallow, then irregular. When he turned her over, her lips had already changed color. She did not respond to his voice or to the mask. Her oxygen flow was insufficient to reverse what her body had already entered. I think about Pemba standing there, holding a mask to the face of someone who had stopped listening to him days ago. That's not a detail I can move past easily. Tess, in the same minutes, pulled off her gloves to adjust her camera settings. Within seconds, her fingers stiffened. She fumbled her regulator connection and briefly disconnected it. Arjun Kale, a climber descending from the summit, witnessed Tess begin staggering in tight circles before falling backward and striking the back of her head against the ice. Her limbs moved briefly, then stopped. Lyra continued filming for several seconds after Tess fell. Pemba shut the camera off and ordered descent. Lyra stopped walking entirely at approximately 8:45 a.m. She sat down in the snow and did not get up. Her mask was on, but her oxygen cylinder was nearly empty. She leaned sideways and went limp. Pemba could not move, her alone. He radioed for assistance at 9:05 a.m. Due to ridge traffic and their position, help did not arrive for approximately 2 hours. All three were declared dead on site. The coroner's summary noted acute hypoxic brain failure and pulmonary edema, consistent with prolonged high-altitude oxygen deprivation. In Tess's case, blunt cranial trauma from the fall was also documented. Frostbite injuries were present on all three. I don't think Lyra, Mika, or Tess really understood, that the mountain doesn't pause for a retake. That's not a character flaw unique to them. But at 27,500 feet, it's the only flaw that matters.